Good evening, everyone. I've started the recording, just so you all know. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Welcome to NAMI Eastside's monthly forum for mental health education, sponsored by Evergreen Health. My name is Edie Myers-Power. I am the Youth and Education Programs Coordinator for NAMI Eastside. All right, I'm going to wait just one more minute for folks to trickle in, and then we will go ahead and get started. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and begin. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending tonight. Again, this is NAMI Eastside's monthly forum for mental health education, sponsored by Evergreen Health. My name is Edie Myers-Power. I'm the Youth and Education Programs Coordinator for NAMI Eastside. I'd like to wish you all a happy Pride Month as we're coming to the end. And also bring attention to the fact that today is PTSD Awareness Day, and both of these things are quite relevant to what you'll be learning tonight from our speaker, Scot. Scot is a queer, neurodivergent climate scientist, writer, and musician who has grappled with mental illness for their entire life and has spent the last decade and a half navigating the mental health care system in this country, seeking healing and relief. Tonight, Scot will discuss complex trauma and healing from complex PTSD, especially as this experience is relevant in the queer community. And with that, Scot, I will go ahead and pass it off to you. Take it away.
Hi, thank you. Give me just a moment to share my screen. Okay, hi, I'm Scot, and today I'm going to talk about healing from complex trauma. I'll leave time at the end for questions, and up front I want to give a content warning. I am going to discuss abuse and trauma in this talk, and in a few seconds I will present some statistics related to mental illness and suicide, although my intent is not to go into graphic detail with any of this. Before I start, I want to thank NAMI Eastside for shining a spotlight on mental health in the queer community for Pride Month, because what we face is grim. Non-heterosexual adults are more than twice as likely as heterosexual adults to have a mental illness, and we are more than 7 times more likely than heterosexual adults to have attempted suicide in our lifetimes. If we look at queer youth, we see that nearly half of queer youth have considered suicide just in the last year. And if we look at non-cisgendered youth, that number jumps above 50%. This is life and death work that NAMI is doing, and I'm grateful. Queer people experience daily trauma in America, and as a result, we suffer from trauma disorders at a far greater rate than other folks. We deal with rejection, bullying, harassment, assault, discrimination from strangers, friends, and family alike. We hear people on television and over the radio saying dehumanizing things about us, and then we hear those things repeated by the people around us. We see legislation being drafted nonstop, aimed at our very livelihoods and personhoods. We deal with hate crimes, assault, threats, discrimination in housing, employment, medical care. We're forced into conversion therapy. The list goes on. I'm not sure that it's possible to live as a queer person in America without experiencing trauma. Trauma is a topic with which I am intimately familiar, not just because of my queer identity. I was born and raised in a conservative, fundamentalist religious environment, which made up my world. And I suffered a lot of abuse and religious trauma at home, school, and work, both related and unrelated to my queer identity. Bigotry towards numerous groups was the norm in that culture, but gender and sexual minorities were a favorite target. This culture also denied the existence of mental illness, which meant that my ADHD went unmanaged as a child, compounding my trauma and amplifying the effects of the C-PTSD that I developed. These experiences and their aftermath have pushed me to self-harm and suicidal ideation at multiple times throughout my life and have in general wreaked havoc in my life. In this talk, I'm going to start by sharing some basics about trauma. Then I'm going to move into the 3 parts of the healing process as I have come to understand it. I'm going to structure this talk to align with the order that I encountered these ideas in my journey. Some may seem strange or inaccessible. If that's the case, it was the case for me too, as I was discovering them. I often had to grasp one part of this healing journey before I was even able to see the next step. So if some parts don't connect right now, that doesn't mean they may not later. And also, these are big topics, so this talk is going to be a fairly general overview. If you want to incorporate some of these ideas into your own journey, your best resource is a good trauma-informed therapist. But if this isn't an option, I'm going to provide a list of some resources that can help even without a therapist. So I'm going to talk about complex trauma today. Trauma is the emotional and physical response that we have to a severely distressing event like actual or threatened death, injury, sexual assault, other violence, etc. And complex trauma is the response to repeated, inescapable, or continuous abuse or traumatic events that last over a period of time. PTSD and complex PTSD, which I'll also refer to as C-PTSD, are trauma disorders. They result when we don't heal from the traumatic experience, but remain stuck in a traumatized state. Fortunately, most people who experience trauma don't go on to develop a trauma disorder. I say fortunately because these are hellish. When we do develop a disorder, though, our trauma symptoms become prolonged and can last months, years, even a lifetime. These disorders can begin immediately following the traumatic experience, or they can start months or years later. PTSD usually develops after a single traumatic event, but CPTSD arises from cases of complex trauma, and so we see CPTSD often in victims of abuse, sex trafficking, survivors of war zones, those sorts of situations. Both PTSD and CPTSD include a wide variety of symptoms with huge overlap. A lot are associated with depression and anxiety, which themselves are symptomatic of PTSD and CPTSD. Other noticeable symptoms include flashbacks, hypervigilance, and even a host of physical ailments. We understand PTSD better than we understand CPTSD. In fact, we only recently have understood CPTSD to be a separate disorder, and many who suffer from it aren't aware of that yet. Unfortunately, CPTSD often involves a more complicated injury, and while tools for healing PTSD can really help with CPTSD, we're learning about more effective ways to treat complex PTSD. Neuroscience research supports the idea that trauma is an injury to our nervous systems, not just a psychological injury, and that PTSD and CPTSD can result when that wound doesn't heal properly. CPTSD in particular represents an injury to our self-identities, to who we perceive ourselves to be. This can often leave us feeling adrift, like we lack a stable center, because that stable center would come from a secure sense of self, which is often missing in CPTSD. As a result of this, CPTSD has some additional concerns beyond PTSD. With CPTSD, we often experience greater difficulties with emotional regulation, a distorted, chaotic sense of self, and particular trouble forming and maintaining relationships. If this has been resonating so far, I'll ask you a few questions to consider right now, drawn from my own experience with CPTSD. Do you feel like you live life on high alert, jumpy, and scared all the time? Well, we know that trauma changes how our nervous systems respond to threats, making it harder to detect threats and leaving us on incredibly high alert all the time. Do you ever feel detached from life, maybe like you're not really alive, just going through the motions? Well, this can be because trauma rewires our brains, leaving them disconnected from our bodies. And particularly, it can impact the parts of our brain involved with agency, motivation, purpose, and even the parts that communicate to us the physical feeling of being alive. Do you feel like you don't know who you are? For me, I have spent my life feeling like I shed parts of myself and added new parts as I moved from situation to situation and felt empty and unseen as a result. Well, trauma also impacts the parts of our brains that are responsible for self awareness and for forming our sense of identity. And finally, do you have trouble forming or maintaining relationships? I know for me, at various times in my life, I thought I was too closed off. Other times, I thought I was too open. Still, other times, too volatile, too broken. Trauma, especially early childhood trauma, obscures pleasure and pain. It obscures love and terror, and it leaves us with a messy, chaotic, and complicated way of relating to others. As many of us learn, the options for trauma healing are varied, sometimes contradictory, often painful, and especially with CPTSD, they don't always come with a great prognosis. We often use similar approaches to treat CPTSD that we've used for PTSD. And many of these, like talk therapy, exposure therapy, and psychoanalysis, can be really helpful. They can also be excruciating because they involve going in and working directly with the wound. And with CPTSD, there are a lot of wounds. Imagine a blind surgeon who was shot with birdshot and now has just hundreds of pellets embedded in their skin. They have the knowledge and the tools that they need to extract those pellets, and there's no doubt that each one they remove contributes to the healing process. But the only way they have to find them is by poking and prodding these wounds, which is an excruciating process and powerful incentive to not keep digging. This reflects to me the grim prognosis that CPTSD often carries. How are we to know when we have dug out the last pellet, uprooted the last trauma? I held this discouraging view for much of my healing journey, and I feared that while I might be able to suffer less as I healed, I wouldn't ever fully heal. But fortunately, this isn't where my talk ends. This is where it starts. I eventually found hope. Complex PTSD is a wound that impacts our very sense of identity. And so healing requires us to connect with that wound, with our very deepest selves, to nurture them and allow them to grow in the ways that trauma prevented. We don't have to find and address each individual trauma, it turns out, only the ones that prevent us from building this connection within ourselves. Once this connection starts forming, though, we start to find joy. I'm using a three-part approach to heal this identity wound within myself. The first part involves regulating my emotions. The second part involves addressing the parts of my subconscious that are stuck in their traumas and blocking me from healing. And then third, it involves connecting with myself on the very deepest levels in order to heal that identity wound. I'll start by discussing regulation. Self-regulation means managing our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors appropriately. The opposite is being dysregulated. When we're dysregulated, we lose the ability to consciously monitor ourselves, and this is driven by emotional experiences. Trauma triggers are called triggers because of how easily they dysregulate us. Conversely, if we're regulated, we're in control, we can think and process, and we can engage with ourselves and others. The second and third parts of the healing process, in my experience, don't really work if I'm dysregulated in the moment, which meant that it was really important for me to learn both how to recognize when I am dysregulated and also how to regulate myself once I discover that I am dysregulated. When we're dysregulated, I lump our experiences into two big buckets. In one bucket, we have hot emotions like rage, panic, and disgust. We experience physical symptoms like high blood pressure, increased heart rate. Sitting still might feel physically painful. In the other bucket, we have cold emotions like despair and hopelessness and dread. We experience dissociation more commonly. And even moving can feel like we are struggling against an enormous weight. For me personally, when I hear the word triggered, it resonates with the first bucket with hot emotions, and the word paralyzed resonates with the second bucket. If you're interested in the resources that I'll share later, I reference the polyvagal theory, which explains how these two buckets connect with how we recognize and respond to threats. I think it's fascinating, but I'm not going to get into it more in the talk. Instead, I'm going to talk about how we regulate once we find ourselves dysregulated. And we immediately run into a problem, which we'll come up against it later in this talk as well, which is that only our conscious minds really use verbal language. So we need more than just words. The rest of our nervous systems, including our unconscious minds, do communicate, but they communicate using sense, impression, emotions, gut feelings, things like that. And communicating within ourselves in those ways can feel really weird at first, especially for people who have this wound that causes our brains to be disconnected from the rest of our nervous systems. There are a lot of tools out there, though, for regulating. The following are tools that I have found particularly helpful for me. I group them into a few categories. First, I have movement-based approaches. I find exercise in general to be helpful, but in particular, drumming, yoga, and dance. Sometimes I need to stimulate my senses. And so I'll listen to music, I'll create art, I'll play with my pets, I'll go out in nature. Certain forms of focused meditation work well for me here. Other times, though, I need to avoid sensory input. And so I'll wear headphones, put on a blindfold, get under a weighted blanket, or practice different forms of meditation until I feel myself moving back into my window of tolerance. This is also the part of the healing model where medications have their value. Psychiatric medications, by and large, help us manage symptoms. They don't cure underlying disorders. Benzodiazepines can help us out of panic attacks, but they're not going to heal an anxiety disorder. SSRIs can reduce the impacts of various mood disorders, but they won't heal the underlying disorder. However, they're incredibly helpful for self-regulation. And remember that unless we're regulated, we can't really effectively move forward with the healing process. I've benefited from quite a few of these over the years, and while I no longer seem to need almost any of them, it's because they helped me when I needed them. If you're interested in learning more about medications as part of this journey, I encourage you to seek out a good psychiatrist. The next part is addressing the traumas that get stuck within us. Fortunately, especially for those of us with complex PTSD and lots of trauma wounds, only some of them need to be addressed directly in order to heal. Also, fortunately, we find pretty quickly that we're not alone in this work. We're made up of multitudes, and those multitudes also want to heal. There are allies, but once again, we find that we speak different languages. When I say we're made up of multitudes, I'm talking about our unconscious minds, which are not unitary, but instead are made of what we call parts. I like Dr. Richard Schwartz's explanation of them, partly because I think it's eloquent, partly because I believe he's the person who coined the term in the first place. Parts are basically inner beings within us that overlay and protect our authentic cores, and they work together to keep us safe and functioning. They serve all sorts of functions within us, and there are a lot of them. They also are somewhat autonomous. They have their own needs, memories, abilities, interests, and understandings of the world. Most of them are content to do their thing, working together to help us exist, but they can also get forced out of their roles and take on burdens of trauma. And when that happens, sometimes they get stuck and they need our help. When My apologies, lost my place for a moment there. The most important takeaway from this section on parts work is that none of these parts are bad. There are no bad parts. All of them are doing their best to do what they feel is in our best survival interest when they form. This may result in some really unpleasant impacts down the road when a part takes on a trauma burden and gets stuck there, but still, there are no bad parts, only wounded ones. To give an example, as a young child, I often had a fawn response to my abusers. This is an unconscious defensive reaction in which we try to appease a perceived threat, and this brought me a lot of shame because I was grappling with memories of being a child and trying to flatter my parents and emotionally regulate for them. Meanwhile, I was terrified. I hated those parts of me for a long time. I hated that even as an adult, there would be times when I felt driven to appease people who hurt me. And I hated how it felt like I was losing pieces of myself when I did so. However, as I learned more and more about engaging with parts and did more work with them, I came to see them differently. These parts formed this fawn response because at the time, I was a small child and I was in danger from big adults. I couldn't outrun them. I couldn't outfight them, and I had to avoid freezing because I knew from lived experience that that tended to make things worse. These parts took the safest option they had, and they put themselves through the pain of using that option in order to save my life. After this realization struck, it was impossible to view them as bad. How could they be when they'd made such a sacrifice? You may be thinking, okay, so there are no bad parts. I hear you. I'll try to ingrain that. But what the hell am I supposed to do with these parts, none of which are bad? The answer is short. Learning to put it into practice takes a bit more. The short answer is we listen to them and we meet their needs. There are a number of techniques for parts work. Internal family systems therapy is effective. That's the technique that Dr. Richard Schwartz came up with, but it's not the only effective approach. I've benefited from it, but I've also benefited from the Hakomi method combined with meditation. Also, parts work is becoming more and more well known in mental health care, so finding a therapist who does parts work is getting easier and easier. We're also seeing rapid advances in psychedelic medicine as an adjunct for therapy, which has the potential to massively amplify the benefits of parts work. So that's something to pay attention to moving forward as well. I've talked about regulation and parts work, but so far, all I've really said is that it's okay if the surgeon only takes out a few pellets and leaves the rest in. This third piece is where we see how the rest of the pellets get removed, but it's also pretty tricky to put into words. We use the concept called the self to engage with the world. We equate this with our conscious experience, and we believe it to control our emotions, thoughts, and decisions. Our brains are wired to play tricks on ourselves to maintain this illusion. We've seen from some clever studies that a lot of our actions arise from our unconscious, and we see our conscious minds activate only after signals were sent to take the action. Our conscious minds will come up with some explanation for why they must have decided to do the action that they observed themselves take. And then they will use that to hold on to the illusion that the conscious mind is the one in control. If this sounds like a shaky sort of illusion, you're right. It is pretty shaky, and it turns out that it causes us a great deal of distress in our lives. It turns out, though, that this self-concept that we hold isn't hardwired into us, and it's not static, although it often seems to be both. It's something that our minds unconsciously shape throughout our lives in response to our experiences, and it becomes the lens through which we experience existence. This is directly related to the damage that trauma can do. We construct this self out of what's available to us at the time. And what's available to us at the time can range from expressions of our deepest, most authentic parts, or it can be deep traumas. I refer to this subjective experience of self as our constructed self. Most of us perceive ourselves to exist as our constructed selves, unaware that our unconscious minds are creating them and that they aren't hardwired. Until that perception changes, it's really difficult to influence how these selves form, are shaped, and behave. It took me a long time to grasp how we create our constructed selves, and what ultimately helped me make the connection was stories. So I will share a couple of from my own journey. Imagine a young child eating a meal with a volatile caregiver when the child accidentally knocks over their glass of water. The caregiver predictably responds with anger and abuse, and in the moment, the child's psyche has few options for how to respond. On one hand, they could recognize that accidents don't reflect on who they are as a person and that the caregiver is wrong for their response. But this comes with it the understanding that the caregiver is dangerous. And when the child is reliant on them to meet all of their needs, that becomes an incredibly hard thing for their minds to hold. So instead, the child's mind will likely internalize some form of the idea that they are bad because they made a mistake. And if they could only be better, be a person who didn't knock over water glasses, then they would be safe and their caregiver would meet their needs. This is often the best sort of option available for that young child, but it also requires that that child internalizes as a part of their constructed self the idea that they are bad, rather than the idea that they can make a mistake and it doesn't reflect on who they are. Now imagine that young child exploring their gender and sexuality, deeply fundamental aspects of us. Now when that child is met with scorn and hatred and abuse, they layer this hatred into their own constructed self. But there's no ridding ourselves of something so innate as our gender and sexuality. So if we layer into our constructed selves that those qualities of ours are bad and worthy of hate, we're left with a constructed self that includes the concept that we are fundamentally flawed and worthy of hatred because of who we authentically are. In my experience, this layering of self-hatred into our constructed selves is one of the most effective recipes out there for producing profound trauma. The story fortunately does not end there. We enter this world with an authentic core, which has needs and desires, and they tend to fall into a few categories. We want to create and express ourselves. We need to explore and experience the world around us, and we need to connect with other people. In an ideal environment, this authentic core would grow into something wondrous and would determine the shape of what becomes our constructed selves. But few environments are ideal, and traumatic environments damage this process unspeakably. At the beginning of the talk, I shared that C-PTSD is an identity wound. That wound forms when trauma drives a wedge between the constructed selves that we are shaping and our authentic cores that we were born with. This creates the emptiness and the lack of identity that characterize C-PTSD. We have a functional identity still, we still have a constructed self, but for us, this is an entity constructed defensively, and it is far from who we naturally would have developed into had we been safe to do so. But also, fortunately, our cores cannot be destroyed. They can be buried and hidden, but they're still there. Trauma causes parts to get stuck trying to protect our cores, and those parts end up obscuring them. When this happens, we end up with a constructed self that differs from who our authentic cores could have developed into, and that is this identity wound. Perhaps the single most important thing that I came to realize on my healing journey is that we can find and reconnect with these cores, and then we can use them to reshape our constructed selves to align with them. It's challenging. We have to dig past the trauma burdens that our parts carry and that we have layered into our constructed selves in order just to connect with our authentic cores in many cases. However, from personal experience, connecting with my authentic core and beginning to nurture it very quickly stripped a huge amount of the power and the hold that my trauma had over me. And the more I deepen that connection and the more I realize that authenticity within myself, the weaker the hold becomes. that my trauma has. This reshaping of the self is like doing an end run around the problem of the blind surgeon. It's like saying that the surgeon doesn't have to remove all the pellets, that as long as they remove the right ones, the ones that are making themselves individually known, as they heal, the skin will push out the rest of those pellets and it will heal and become whole with nothing more than scars. The surgeon doesn't need to go and dig for every single pellet if they are to have hope of fully healing. I think of this process in two parts. The first, and by far the hardest part for me, was finding and connecting with my core. Once we find and connect with our cores, though, the second part involves nurturing them and using what we find there to reshape our constructed selves. The first part of the process involves listening, not with our ears, but with our minds and our hearts. We have to be regulated because dysregulation is loud, and what we're listening for here is really quiet. We have to work with our parts that need attention as well, because remember that our parts, when they're carrying traumas, hide these cores. For me, this involved a combination of a lot of meditation, a lot of time in therapy, particularly with the Hakomi method, and a lot of practicing mindfulness in daily life. But as I did these things and listened, eventually I started to notice tiny voices speaking with feelings and emotions, not with words. And as I listened to them more and more, I slowly came to understand what they were saying and recognize that they were speaking from some very authentic part of me. Once we've formed that connection with our core, then we must give those cores voice and expression. This also involves listening, not just to our minds, but to our bodies. And here we're listening for clues. We know that our cores have certain needs. So we want clues for what experiences to have, what activities to pursue, how to try to express ourselves, and what people around us we feel drawn to connect with. Those clues help us find the actions to take to shape our constructed selves to better align with our cores. And from my experience, when something speaks to your core, it resonates through your whole being. And when I started giving voice to my core, I found that even joy began to enter the healing process. I'll share just one of many examples of how this played out for me. Music is a huge part of my authentic core, I now understand. But growing up, it was not a part of my constructed self because making noise at home was dangerous. I wanted to play music from a young age, especially rhythm, but I experienced a lot of trauma as I was exploring, and so I stopped. Once I was an adult, I let myself try to learn music, but even then, my explorations came with shame and fear and self-doubt, and I could only bring myself to practice instruments that were quiet and that I could play through headphones. However, as I found and started to listen to my core, I came to recognize that that desire to play drums, which were the most appealing instrument to me as a young child, but also the most dangerous, was still very alive within me. And with my therapist's encouragement, I invested in a budget kit a couple years ago. Looking back, it's clear pretty much from my first session playing that this desire came from my authentic core. And I've experienced a creative outpouring as a result, writing more music in the last few months than I have in the last 20 years. Drumming has now become one of my best tools for emotional regulation, a wonderful meditative focus, and more than anything else I've done in my life with music, it brings me joy. I've been layering this love of drumming into my constructed self, and by doing so, I've been bringing that more in alignment with my authentic core and working to heal that identity wound just a bit more. Recently, I discovered another mode of consciousness within myself. This is something we tap into whether we realize it or not in things like flow states, and it tends to bring incredible peace. And humans have spent terrific energy seeking it throughout history. Although it's accessible, a lot of people never really fully experience it because it can be tricky to learn how to find. And yet again, the theme comes up of words falling short of being able to describe the thing. It has a lot of names. I've heard it at various times called the egoless self, the mindfulness wedge, flow, empty mind, the witness, wedge of awareness. Today, I'm using the term objective self. And in this state, we fully experience life as our constructed selves, including fully experiencing our emotions as they occur. But a part of us also remains separate from all of that, that allows us to also observe the process as it takes place. I don't know whether that sounds like something particularly incredible to you or not at this point, but when I first experienced it and then continued to experience it, I came to recognize that in that place, I was no longer becoming overwhelmed by my experiences. And I had an incredible position from which to self-regulate, to protect myself from trauma, to work with my parts, and to affect the shaping process of my constructed self. This objective self contains the constructed self, but extends beyond it. So we're able to observe and affect this self-formation process as it takes place. We can observe our authentic cores from here, and we can better recognize their needs and their desires and use them to shape our constructed selves. Before I discovered this objective self, I was doing this reshaping work, but I was doing it in the dark. However, experiencing this objective self was like turning the lights on, and suddenly I could see much more clearly what I was doing. The objective self has incredible emotional reserves, capacity for self-regulation and empathy, including empathy for oneself. In this place, I can experience devastatingly painful emotions without that pain becoming suffering. I can hold the constructed self during the psychological surgery that I've been talking about, and it allows us to recognize and connect with our cores in incredible ways. It exists within us, but we remain unaware of it until we have an experience of it. But once you've experienced it, I don't think that there's really any way to lose the awareness that it exists in there. There have been plenty of times since finding it when I wasn't able to access it because I was too dysregulated, but I've always been able to get back there, and I never lost the understanding that it was in there. There isn't one right way to go about finding it. There are a lot of approaches, and they range from the neurological to the psychological to the philosophical to the spiritual. For me, again, this came back to a lot of meditation, occasionally assisted with entheogens, and a lot of Hakomi method and a lot of therapy. I wasn't doing these things to seek this self. I didn't even know that it existed. Rather, I was meditating to self-regulate. And when I do that, I try to subtract more and more things from my awareness. And one day, as best as I can tell, I removed enough that my awareness shifted, and suddenly I was existing as this different state. And then after a lot of time talking about it with my therapist and other people, I came to recognize what it was and to better understand it and to start to be able to use it to affect my own healing process. My healing journey since gaining this understanding has looked and felt very different from before. It's not so painful, even though the intensity of the emotions is just as strong. I can now experience them without being consumed by them and without fear and anxiety of those emotions taking hold and transforming them into suffering. Remaining as the objective self has also gotten easier with practice. At first, I could only get there in deep meditative states or when working with my awesome therapist using the Hakomi method. I still mostly do the healing work in meditation and therapy, but it's a lot easier now. And I'm able to find and recognize and work with my parts sometimes even during normal waking life. Once I managed to unlock that door, opening it has been rapid in comparison. To conclude, I want to share a handful of the most helpful things to me on my own journey. First, I now think of the healing process as a process of listening and remembering. If we go deep within ourselves and listen, we find that what we're looking for, this authentic core, is within us. And we find that deep parts of our unconscious remember where, but the language is really weird. Second, healing is relational. Talk to people who support your healing, not to people who undermine you. These people don't need to be on the same journey and they don't need to have anything insightful to say. It's awesome if they do, but the key here is engaging with safe people who we feel close to. Third, express yourself and explore. These are a couple of the qualities that seem to be nearly universally within our authentic cores. Like I said in my talk, we're social and we desire connection, we're curious and we want to explore, and we are creative and we want to express ourselves. So many of us have had these qualities forced into suppression, and so we stop enthusiastically exploring, creating, and relating. But these qualities don't disappear. Finding them and tapping back into them has been one of the greatest gifts that I could have found on my healing journey. So I encourage you to find safe people and then express yourself and explore. Fourth, meditate. Meditate like your life depends on it. Mine almost certainly did on more than one occasion. Plus, our unconscious minds are vast and our conscious minds are small in comparison. There's a world in there and it's fascinating to get to know. Meditation can be discouraging to get the hang of. I know this personally. It took me years of trying before I really got the hang of it. But it's one of those things like riding a bike where once it clicked, from then on, it stayed clicked. And at times I've been too dysregulated to meditate in the moment, but the issue has never been that I lost the hang of how to do it. Guides, therapists, friends who meditate, YouTube videos can all help you get the hang of it, but stick with it. Fifth, be your own ally. No one can be an ally to us in our healing journeys as deeply as we can be to ourselves. Be gentle with yourself and remember that there are no bad parts and that the journey isn't linear. There are ups and downs. There will be times when you feel like you're making awesome progress, but then there will also be times when you feel like you're backsliding. I encourage you to stick with it. C-PTSD is a hellish injury, but it's survivable and we can heal. We need to regulate ourselves because dysregulation is loud and it interferes with the other parts of the process. But once we're regulated, we can go inside ourselves and work with our stuck parts. And as we free those parts, we can connect with our authentic core and realign our constructed selves to heal the fundamental identity wounds within us. Accessing the objective self helped me to understand on a much deeper level that full healing from complex trauma is possible. We won't ever embody our authentic cores exactly how we would have absent our traumas. Those traumas leave scars and those scars remain visible, but they don't need to cause suffering for our entire lives. And they don't detract from the wonder and the beauty and the majesty that our authentic cores can unfold into once we connect with them and nurture them to do so. As we heal from C-PTSD and come to embody our authentic cores, we are no less beautiful because of the scars that we carry. Thank you. I'll take questions, and as soon as I can figure out how, I will share a link to the resources document.
Scott, you can go ahead and answer questions and I can share the link if you'd like.
The link is sent.
Oh.
Yeah, I'll take any questions or comments anybody has. That is a very good question, Axton. For the last, I'd say for about the last year, I have been slowly looking for ways in which I can put myself out there in the world more and be of service to others and help other people in their own healing journeys. And so my hope is that a year from now, I'll be doing that, but in much bigger ways. What would I say to young Scott? That is a very good question. And there are sort of two different forms of answers. There are the things that I understand now that I wish young Scott could understand. Things like what he's going through is terrible, but that it will eventually get better and that healing is possible. But I don't think little Scott would have been able to understand that. So I think little Scott needed to hear a lot of messages to just hang in there, to just keep going, and that he would survive. Elizabeth asked, if one has trouble relaxing in order to meditate or feels sharp pain when trying to sit still in meditation, what helps? So great question. And the answer varies depending on the kind of meditation you're doing. I mentioned meditation for self-regulation. And when I'm doing that, my goal is to clear my awareness of whatever I can. So physical pains, typically I will try to adjust my position in order to get the pain to go away. I might do a little stretching, see if that helps. But sometimes it comes down to a practice of just trying to intentionally ignore that pain if I can't get it to go away through some other reason. But in my mind, the goal is to get that discomfort to go away, not necessarily to force it to go away through efforts of will. In other forms of meditation, having a focus can help. Focusing on a particular image or sound or thought can oftentimes help me ignore signals that I'm getting from my body. Michelle asks, did you work through the book, The Body Keeps the Score, with my therapist? I did not work through it with my therapist. It was recommended to me by the first of the two wonderful therapists that I've seen. The first, unfortunately, moved to a different state, and so I had to stop seeing her. But I've read through it on my own several times. If your fears are coming from concerns over its content, it does talk a lot about trauma, and Van der Kolk does share some potentially triggering stories about what he experienced in his career with people. Going through it with a therapist might be a great idea, a great way to get around those fears. There have also been times when I was reading through it where I had to put it down for a little while, give myself a couple weeks to process something that had impacted me from it before I picked it up again. So if you do tackle the book, I encourage you to be gentle with yourself as you go through it, because there's plenty in there that can be triggering. But of all of the resources I provide, it was the single most helpful thing for me for shifting my understanding about trauma and the healing process. Oh, another comment about Elizabeth's question about meditation. I like having a variety of methods of meditating available to me, because one may not work in a given moment. In my mind, I sort of categorize meditation techniques in two ways. One category, there are techniques aimed at emptying our minds. In the other, there are techniques aimed at focusing on something, whether that's a feeling, a sound, a physical object. And oftentimes, especially if I'm particularly dysregulated, meditating to empty my mind can feel inaccessible, but doing one form or another of a focus meditation can help me get around the dysregulation more effectively. Conversely, when I'm trying to connect with the authentic parts of myself, I tend to find it most helpful to practice meditation to empty my mind rather than focusing. And there are a variety of different forms of meditation that fit within these two buckets. So I encourage you to explore, see what's out there. If you hear of a different form of meditation, give it a try. See if it works for you and add it to your toolkit. C-PTSD is a big injury and it has massive repercussions throughout our lives. And I'm of the opinion that we should throw all the tools we have at it. Well, thank you, Cheryl. I appreciate the kind words. Does anybody else have any questions or comment? Oh, Elizabeth asks, what are the dangers of admitting that you have CPTSD? How do you decide when to disclose? That is an excellent question. And I'm going to answer it on a couple of different levels. I mentioned in my talk that CPTSD only recently has been distinguished from PTSD. It was first put forth as a separate diagnosis in the 90s. And it is not part of the DSM yet, although it is part of the ICD-11. So one danger of disclosing CPTSD is simply of not being understood, because a lot of people don't know what it is. They don't know that it's a separate disorder. It is also a concern that depending on who you disclose that to, they may treat you differently afterwards. I've experienced that with plenty of people in my life. Even though PTSD is much more well known, and in my experience is often what people will associate when I say CPTSD if they don't know the difference, which honestly is fair because there's a huge degree of overlap between the two. It loses some important nuances about CPTSD, but even PTSD, despite being more well known, is often very misrepresented in the media and in the news, and therefore it's misunderstood in a lot of people's minds. And so if you are considering disclosing it to somebody, I encourage you to think about how they might respond and what the consequences might be on you if they respond negatively. It can also, it is not something that I personally would disclose during something like a job interview, because while discrimination based on things like that is illegal, a hiring committee wouldn't necessarily have to say that they weren't hiring me because I have CPTSD. They could come up with some other reason. And it's not information that they need to have, honestly. So it is a tough question, and the answer will vary situationally and ultimately come down to what's best for you and what's safest for you in the moment. Okay, Kathy asks, what videos, YouTube, and books would I recommend? What are the best tools? Okay, so I will send the link again to the resources page. This has a lot of a lot of books and articles on it. There are a lot of talks on YouTube as well. I didn't add any to this document, unfortunately, because it felt quite long to begin with, and I was worried about it being too unwieldy. Uh, but the authors of these books, in many cases, have a lot of talks available on YouTube if you search for them. Regarding my suggestions for self-help, I think I would start with the items in bold on that resources list that I shared. And in particular, I would start with the three books, The Body Keeps the Score, Anchored, and No Bad Parts. I'll type those into chat as well. Between those three books, you will learn about a lot of techniques and tools available for helping with regulation and for starting to work with your traumatized parts. Regarding therapists, if you're not aware, a lot of therapists operate on a sliding scale, which enables lower income people to access their services in many cases. A therapist may not advertise that on their website, but it's a question that you can ask a potential therapist when you reach out. Unfortunately, in this country, the way health insurance companies go about doing business, access to therapy can be challenging. I wish you all the best of luck there. I wish I had more concrete advice that I could give you. I can say, though, that having some keywords in mind when interviewing potential therapists, like parts work, internal family systems, trauma-informed, polyvagal, things like that, will help you get a sense of if it's even a person who has knowledge and experience with the sorts of things that you're seeking a therapist for. Okay, Lillian asks, there are times when my mind becomes paralyzed with that when even trying to think about addressing trauma. Do you have any suggestions on how to get through or over that initial hurdle? So I do. That paralysis sounds to me like there's a good chance that it's a reaction from your nervous system to a threat. When a part takes on a trauma burden, that part from then on remains stuck in that moment when it experienced that trauma. And when that traumatized part comes up, it thinks that moment is still occurring. And so that can lead to us experiencing physiological threat responses, even though there is no threat present. We're just experiencing a memory or a thought. So the word paralysis that you use connects with the second of the two buckets that I mentioned in my talk, the one that has the cold emotions like dread and despair. That bucket corresponds with the freeze response to threats. And so the ways to get out of the freeze response tend to involve self-soothing, and they can also involve movement. For me, it usually starts with self-soothing. So I will often start by putting on headphones, putting on a weighted blanket, and not trying to force my mind in any certain direction, but to just be there for a bit and let that part relax. Once I'm starting to feel like I'm coming out of that paralysis, and this is a place where I've gotten better and better at recognizing when this was within my capability the more I practiced. But at some point, there will come a point when I can start to move. And it's a small motion that I'm referring to at first here. I will start by like tapping my foot or wiggling a finger or something like that, because something small is typically the first thing accessible to me. But then once I'm moving in some way, I find that I can build inertia. So if I'm tapping my foot, then I might later turn that into bouncing my leg. And then as I bounce my leg, maybe I can start tapping one of my hands to that rhythm. And if I add pieces like that, uh, eventually I find that I'm functional again and I can actually get up and walk around and I'm calmer and I'm closer to being regulated. However, that doesn't really help with the immediate reaction to the trauma if you're trying to address a particular trauma. In that case, what's probably needed is some parts work because it sounds like that may be a protector part that's coming up to try to protect you from what it feels is ongoing trauma. So I encourage you there to dig into the book No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz. Uh, he talks about this a lot, about how to interact with our parts and get to know them. You can start by talking to it, treat it like a person. Um, Say hello internally. And this may sound weird. It sounded weird to me at first, but it works. Uh, and then listen to it. See if you can tell what it's afraid of. If it's afraid, for instance, that if you go and experience those emotions that would come up when you address trauma, maybe that part is afraid that you're going to break down in tears and that adult figures around you are going to respond abusively towards you as a result. I'm drawing that as an example because it's the sort of thing that I experienced a lot as a child. When the part is stuck in that place, the part literally feels like it is surrounded by those same threatening adults and that it is life or death for that part to stop whatever it feels I am going to do that would put me in danger with them. Fast forward to present, our adult selves, we are no longer in those situations. And so oftentimes, all that's really needed is to get the message across to that part that we're not stuck there anymore. One thing can that for a lot of people can get to the heart of it quickly is asking the part, once you make contact with the part, ask it how old it thinks you are. And whatever number pops up, if a number pops up, and it won't always, there's a good chance that that is the age that that part thinks you are, which is also the age that it probably is. So think about what sorts of things you might have experienced at that age that would have produced similar feelings in you, and think about what you might have needed at that age and see if you can give those things to that part in any way. In the example that I gave, I might reassure that part that those experiences were awful, but we are away from those people now, and we have been for many, many years. And I also find that layering in messages of gratitude towards my parts when I'm interacting with them acts like a force multiplier with them and tends to evoke really powerful responses a lot of the time. Our parts are fundamentally on our sides. You remember, the ones that are carrying trauma burdens are carrying trauma burdens because they took them on because they love us. They wanted to save us. And so they are desperately trying still to do their best for us. And so once they recognize that we are reaching out with the same intent, suddenly we become a team with them. And the process gets easier and easier. And thank you for taking your time to listen to the talk. And thank you for the kind words. Are there any other questions or comments? Thank you for the kind words. Okay. Thanks everyone again for taking your time to be here and listen to me. I hope you got something of value from the talk. Um, and regardless, I hope you all go out to connect with yourselves and live rich, fulfilled lives.
Yes, thank you so much, Scott. Thank you for being here and for sharing your knowledge with us and answering all these questions. I think I learned a lot today, so I hope everybody else did too. And that resource list, so extensive and so helpful. So thank you so much for sharing everything tonight, Scott. Really appreciate it. Um, Thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to share a link in the chat. You're also going to get directed to this link when you exit the Zoom room. It's just a program survey that we use to continue to get grant support funds to continue to have these kinds of events. So we hope that you will join us for more of these forums in the future. Please fill out that survey if you have the time and the ability. And other than that, I hope that you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to stop the recording and we will wrap things up. Thanks, everyone.